Let's talk about top fermentation beers, ales. And let's start in England. And let's start with English Pale Ale. If you go to a pub in England, ask for a pint of bitter, that is draft pale ale. That's pale ale with a hand pump. And what you're going to find is a product that is not particularly alcoholic. It's probably going to be somewhere between 3.2, 3.3 and 4.5% alcohol by volume. And the reason for that is in England and in the rest of the United Kingdom, the tax on beer is paid in proportion to alcoholic strength. So every 0.1% increase in alcohol means more taxation, means more expense. And this tends to keep the alcohol content relatively low. These beers are produced with pale malt, maybe some small amounts of the lighter specialty malts. So they tend to have a sort of a coppery sort of colour, quite malty. The further north you go, the more malty they become, somewhat less hoppy going further north. They tend to have a modest degree of hop aroma on these products. And people say to me, you're English, you drink beer warm. Well, if you think 55 Fahrenheit is warm, then you've got a different idea of warm to what I have. But that is the classic cellar temperature, with these beers in barrels traditionally in the cellar underneath the pub and pumped up into your glass in the bar. So they're not served cold, but they're certainly not warm. Traditionally, what happens is after fermentation, the beer is what they call racked into the barrels, and into that barrel, as well as the beer, you are putting some extra sugar, there is some yeast, and what the yeast is going to do is to convert that sugar into natural carbonation, into carbon dioxide, to finish the conditioning of the beer and develop those last amounts of carbon dioxide. These beers are not particularly fizzy, not particularly effervescent. It's a fairly low concentration of carbon dioxide, and that final priming source of carbonation is happening in the finished barrel. Historically also, a handful of hops will be put into the beer at this stage to introduce this dry hop character. And also one other thing, there is a protein that is extracted from the swim bladders of fish from the South China Seas. So inside the fish, there is a swim bladder. It's an organ whereby if the fish wants to rise, it puts air into that swim bladder and it rises. If it wants to sink, it excludes the air from that swim bladder and it sinks. Now, sometime, somewhere, somehow, and who knows how, somebody found out you could take the swim bladder, you could dry it, you could chop it up, you could dissolve it and extract a protein which, when you put it into beer or wine, will react with the yeast and it will all settle out and clarify. And that is called fining. Who'd have thought it? Now, American Pale Ale is rather different. Let's go to the Sierra Nevada Brewery at Mills River to find out how. So let's turn to what is probably the most iconic craft beer ever brewed in the United States of America, and that is this, the ultimate North American Pale Ale. This is Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. This is the beer that made Sierra Nevada famous. Much more alcoholic than the pale ales that you will find in England, the bitters that you'll find in England. This is 5.6% ABV. And a very pronounced bitterness. It's well into the mid-30s IBUs, but known for the hoppy nose, the cascade hop, which some people interpret as being like a grapefruit character. And naturally conditioned, there's yeast in this bottle. And when the brewers finish the brewing process, they leave some sugar in there and the yeast, and then that is stored in the warehouse, and the sugars are converted by the yeast into carbonation, extra carbonation. So that's how the final carbon dioxide level is ensured in this particular beer. There are bigger pale ales. We call them India Pale Ales. The India Pale Ales, there's a little bit of romance about the story of the IPAs, But the story goes something like this, that back in the day when the British Empire had much of the world painted red, the jewel in the crown was India. And they wanted to export beer to India from Britain. And so they designed the IPAs, which were quite alcoholic and quite bitter, the alcohol and the bitter suppressing the growth of bacteria. So these were stronger pale ales. In North America these days, the IPAs are a little bit different to what they would have been back in those days. Yes, back in the day, they were about alcohol and bitterness, but these days we've got extra hops in there as well. So here is an example of an IPA. This is Torpedo. So named, of course, because of the vessel, the torpedo, that Sierra Nevada use. They pack it with hops and they cycle the beer through those hops to extract all that oil, to extract those intense hop aromas. And this is very much about the aroma. This is all about the intensity of different flavors that are coming from a selection of hop varieties. The great thing about Sierra Nevada is if you go to their website, you can actually read all about the ABVs and the IBUs and which hops they actually use and which malts that they use for different types of product. So it's a very useful and a very straightforward website to use. So this is, they actually call it an extra IPA. This has got an alcohol content in the low 7s. So this is a beer with a lot of oomph behind it. There are other types of IPAs as well. One of my personal favorites is black IPA. This is this is where stout meets IPA. So it's got the rich roastness coming from heavily roasted grains, black malts, roasted barley, but it's also got the big hoppy noses as well. And these work very, very well. It's all about balance and having, if you've got a beer with big flavors, there may be a lot of malt, maybe a lot of hops, they work. You may have a very gently flavored beer, that works as well. But black IPAs are very, very intensely flavored and very delicious, in my opinion, and it is all about opinion. Brut IPAs. This is a relatively recent innovation. Anybody who drinks champagne knows about the term brut, referring to dryness. So these are relatively dry IPAs that are delivered and developed to have a lot of the fermentation of every last bit of sugar out of that particular product. And then we have perhaps the most recent innovation, and that is hazy IPAs. I find it's amusing to me that for more than 40 years in the brewing industry, I have always preached the creed that beers, with the exception of Hefeweizens, should be what we call bright, not cloudy. But in recent times, particularly led in the United States of America, there is this interest in deliberately cloudy, turbid beer. And we differentiate between the West Coast IPAs and the East Coast IPAs. The West Coast IPAs are things like Torpedo, which have got a very high bitterness, but also this big hoppy nose as well. The East Coast IPAs, some people call them New England IPAs, some people call them juicy IPAs. These are the turbid ones. They're not so much about bitterness. They're not particularly bitter, but they really, really do have a very pronounced hoppy nose, fruity, big. And this is because they add lots of hops downstream, right the way through the process. They're adding hops all the time, right the way through to the end. So here's a great example. This is Hazy Little Thing. And this is the Sierra Nevada take on the East Coast IPA, the cloudy IPA. Very turbid, state secret how they ensure it's consistently cloudy, let me tell you. But beautiful nose, beautiful flavor, and doing very well in the marketplace. Let me tell you, it's easier to make a bright beer than one that is consistently turbid, consistently cloudy. That's where the state secret will remain. Now let's turn to barley wines. Barley wines so called because they've got high alcohol content, high ABVs, comparable with those of some wines. Certainly historically, wines, many wines, grape wines, were around 10% alcohol by volume. And that's the sort of region you've got a barley wine in. And the reason is that you present the yeast with a very strong wort, with a lot of sugars in it. And of course, the yeast is going to take those sugars and ferment them into alcohol and carbon dioxide, of course. So the more sugar you've got in the wort, the stronger the beer is going to be. Now, the way for a barley wine that you concentrate the sugars in the wort is to boil and boil for a long time. So you're boiling off water and therefore concentrating the sugar solution. When you're boiling for a long time also, you're introducing other sorts of flavors into the brew. So these are very complex beers with very intense flavors. And when the yeast is fermenting at very high sugar concentrations, then it itself produces more molecules that we call esters. I'll talk about those in a later lecture, which have got very fruity flavors. Now, the classic barley wine was the Bass No. 1 barley wine, which was 10.5% alcohol by volume. And it was named No. 1 because that was the No. 1 brew house in Burton-on-Trent in England. Prolonged boil, but also stored, aged. And the Sierra Nevada take on barley wine is Bigfoot barley wine, a very famous beer. And as I look at the top of this particular beer, I'm seeing the number 2019, 2019. So this is a product which is very alcoholic. Here we are in the 10% region. And this is one of the types of beer that you can age. So if you come to the tap room at Mills River or to the pub in Chico, you can do a vertical tasting of Bigfoot barley wine. So you can see how 2019 is comparing with 2018 and so on, to see how they're aging. So just as you would perhaps age a wine and talk about the maturation of that wine, so you can do it with a Bigfoot barley wine. So those are quite strong beers. Let's turn to a somewhat less alcoholic beer. Let's start talking about mild ale. Mild ale. Mild ale is draft beer that is called brown ale when it's in a bottle. And this is old-fashioned English beer. Actually, I'm very partial to mild ales. It's going out of fashion now. There's an adage that you don't drink what your mum and dad drank, but we need to get away from that. And I think there's a lot to be said for rediscovering this beer style. But these were beers that were very low in alcohol, maybe only 3% alcohol by volume, 3.5% possibly, tended to be darker than the pale ales because they included some of the caramel malts, which give a nice toffee, sweetish, mellow flavor. Not particularly alcoholic, as I've said, not particularly bitter, and very, very drinkable. And actually, back in the day, quite nutritious, considered to be quite nutritious as well. Somewhat related to this beer style would be an amber ale. Of course, in North America, an amber ale would be more alcoholic than a mild ale, certainly. It's probably going to at least be in the 4.5% range. But again, a beer that is made with significant amounts of caramel, crystal malts to give this extra color and extra flavor. The other extreme, of course, of really pale malts would give you a blonde ale. You might actually use a very, very lightly dried malt, which is called a Pilsner malt, because it's the style of malt that's used for Pilsner beers. But a blonde ale would be very low in color and relatively gently flavored, not containing much in the way of specialty malts. It has to be said, there's a lot of overlap between beer styles. And one person's blonde ale, it may be somebody else's pale ale. It's what do you say it is on the label that really matters. If we go further north in the British Isles, we come to Scotland. And what you'll find is that the ales in Scotland, the Scotch ales, are usually more malty and less hoppy, and they may be darker than those you'll find in England, certainly further south in England. And you might still come across the term shilling. When I was a young lad, right the way until going to university, the currency in Britain was the pound, which would be 20 shillings. So the 20 shillings in a pound before decimalisation. And as I've said previously, taxation is on the basis of alcoholic strength. So the stronger the beer, the greater the taxation. And back in the day of shillings, that meant more shillings. So Scotch beer, Scotch ale, is described in terms of shilling. You may go through 60 shillings, right the way through to the very strong beers that would be 160 shillings. Beers that at the lower end, in Scotland, they call them light beers. Not to be confused with light as is used in the United States, but light as in lower alcohol. And right the way through to heavy. So the heavy beers would be the ones that have more alcohol, higher shilling value, more alcohol by volume. People talk about Irish red ales. It's a little bit of a marketing thing these days. There certainly was a ruby ale that used to be sold in Wexford in Ireland. So that extra colour is coming from a mixture of the stronger caramelised malts, but perhaps a little bit of some of the more dark malts as well, to give a rich red colour. So a red ale is really about the colour as much as anything else, but marketing. Let's turn to another famous English beer style, and that is porter. Now, we've talked about taxation. Back in the day, the taxation was on the basis of the malt. And as we've seen, the last stage in the malting process is kilning, drying. And if you dried malt back in those days over coke, it tended to give a cleaner product than if you dried it over burning lumps of wood. So the malt that was made in a coarse way over burning lumps of wood was cheaper, and therefore the beer was cheaper. And it was affordable for people who didn't have a lot of money, people like the porters in the markets in London. And so the beer was called porter. Then they changed things so they could actually make the malt in a cleaner way, the dark malts in a cleaner way. And so that history, it's pure history. That's not how you make a porter nowadays. You don't dry the malt over burning lumps of wood. But this darker style of product. Nowadays, a porter is going to be made with substantial amounts of pale malt, because it's always pale malt is the main malt in a brew, but with significant proportions of, say, a chocolate malt to give that stronger flavour and stronger colour. Now, you'll have heard of Guinness. Arthur Guinness, he made an extra stout porter. A bigger version, if you like, with a greater degree of roasted character in it. Over time, they dropped the word extra, they dropped the word porter, and therefore they just call it stout. And there are different types of stouts, including imperial stouts. Imperial stouts were first designed and brewed for the courts of the Tsars and Tsarinas of Russia and exported to the crown courts of Russia. And these were very highly alcoholic, imperial stouts. If you see the word imperial, then it's invariably associated with this higher alcohol content. And those beers may very well be aged these days in barrels, oak barrels, often bourbon barrels. So they've been used once for bourbon and then sold to the brewer, still got some bourbon left behind, and then these imperial stouts put into the barrel. They'll take up some of that bourbon character and character from the barrel as well. And you get some very interesting effects with prolonged aging of these products. Sweet stouts are basically an English product, rather lower alcohol content in the low 3s, and they're sometimes called milk stouts. And the reason is that in the process you add lactose, which is milk sugar. Now, lactose is not fermentable by yeast. It's put into the boil, so it survives the fermentation, and it gives residual sweetness and body to this style of beer. So it's called a milk stout or a sweet stout. But there are types of stouts as well. You may have heard of an oatmeal stout. This contains a proportion of oatmeal, and that tends to give a drier character. One other type of product I should mention amongst the ales are the winter ales. Historically, these were beers that were served up in the winter months, in the cold of England, and they contain spices. They may be even served warm or even hot. They might have bits of fruit thrown in there, like a punch almost. There's a well-known beer brewed in the United States every year, and it changes every year, and the recipe is always a secret, but it's a winter ale that comes out from a company in California every winter. Let's turn to Belgium. And I often say that there is more reverence for beer in Belgium than in any other country in the world. They certainly have some very interesting products. In the last lecture, we talked about the lambics and the gueurs. Let's now talk about the Trappist beers. And of course, these are beers that are brewed by Trappist monks in Trappist monasteries. If this style of beer is brewed in any other type of monastery, or indeed in any other type of brewery, you can't call it Trappist. So the word that's used then is abbey ale. So an abbey ale would be this style of product made in anything other than a Trappist brewery. Now, the greater number of Trappist breweries are in Belgium, but there are some in the Netherlands, there's one in Austria, there's one in France, there's one in Italy, there's one in Spain, and there is one in the United States, and now one in the United Kingdom as well, in terms of accreditation for making Trappist beers. Now, these can be fairly alcoholic, up to maybe 12.5% alcohol by volume. And the way in which they get to this higher alcohol content is by adding some extra sugar in the boiling stage. Okay, so most of the carbohydrate is coming in the wort from the malt, of course, but some extra sugar. We call it candy sugar, C-A-N-D-I. Candy sugar, which comes from sugar beet, is added in the boil to boost the sugar content, so you get a stronger wort and therefore a stronger beer. And there are different classifications depending on the strength. Okay, so you've got enkel, you've got double, you've got triple, and you've got quadruple. Okay, and this is good illustration of the fact that there is no simple relationship between alcoholic strength and color. Okay, so for example, a double tends to be a brown ale almost, a darker product with a greater degree of color than a triple. A triple tends to be a much lighter color than a double. But they're all pretty alcoholic, got a pretty good kick on them. They're very warming, should we say. There's another product style in Belgium called red ale, Belgian Reds. Again, with the extra color produced from the heavily roasted grain. Now, these are frequently soured with so-called lactic acid bacteria, bacteria that produce acid, lactic acid. So they tend to have a sourness, and they also will tend to be aged in oak barrels to develop maturation flavor and so on. One type of beer is oat Brewing, which is aged for at least 1 year in barrels. Another type of product is saison. A lot of people are interested in saisons. What I like to say is every saison is different. Saison beers that were made for the saisonniers, the itinerant farm workers that would go from farm to farm, and in the season the beer would be brewed basically with whatever was available on that farm. So saison is a style of beer that there's no hard and fast rule about what goes into making it. A related product from the French is bière de garde, garden beer. Another style of beer, wit beer. Wit beer is wheat beer. So here's a good example of a beer where the primary grist in material is wheat. We talked about the fact that there's always some barley there to provide the husk for the filter bed, but the wit beer is primarily made from wheat. And two other interesting ingredients are included in a traditional wit beer. The first of these is coriander. So coriander is added to the brew, and the second is citrus peel or citrus, giving a fruity type of character as well. And these are beers that are NQB, as I like to say, not quite bright. They've got a turbidity about them. We've got this interesting, refreshing character that's coming from the wheat, the coriander, and from the citrus. Let's turn to German type ale products, top fermentation product. And let's start with alt. The word alt in German means old. So these are beers that were brewed in the old way. Now in the next class we'll talk about bottom fermentation beers, lager beers. That was viewed as the new way. So alt, the old way, the ale brewing traditions. They're somewhat similar to the English pale ale, but they're going to be a little bit more alcoholic, maybe 5% alcohol by volume, and probably a little bit darker as well. They would include a malt style called Vienna malt, which is more intensely dried than the pale malt. Then we have Kölsch. Kölsch is a beer style that comes from Cologne. And the interesting thing about this is it's almost a hybrid. So this is an ale because it is made with an ale yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But the conditions under which it's operating are lager type conditions, much lower temperatures. So it's an ale yeast working under lager conditions. It's a fairly light, much lighter product than is alt, similar alcohol concentration, but it's using the paler malts. Weizenbier. Weizenbier. The word Weizen, white, wheat. So these are primarily wheat, at least 50% malted wheat. And these are probably the most effervescent beers you're going to find. A very high level of carbon dioxide. They should have two characteristics. An authentic Weizenbier should have two characteristics. The first is it should smell of cloves. Some people call it medicinal, but a clove-like aroma. And that's because the ale yeast that makes the Weizenbiers produces this clove-like aroma. Other ale strains do not, but this one does. So if you are not getting a clove-like character, the brewer has not used the right yeast strain. The second thing that yeast makes is a lot of something we call isoamyl acetate. Banana aroma. Some people call it bubblegum. So your Weizenbier should smell of cloves and it should smell of bananas or bubblegum or whatever you like to call it. Very light color, but cloudy, usually. The reason is that most of these Weizenbiers still have yeast in there, and they're called Hefeweizen. Hefeweizen. The Hefe means the yeast. Let's talk about a specific example of a Hefeweizen, and for this I'm going to turn to Kellerweiss, which is the Sierra Nevada take on Hefeweizen. Ken Grossman went to Germany to get the special yeast, the ale yeast, which produces two particular substances that are associated with a Hefeweizen. The first of these is a substance that gives the aroma of cloves. No other ale yeast gives that clove-like aroma, just this type of ale yeast. And the second thing that the Hefeweizen yeast does is make a lot of banana aroma. Now, all brewing yeasts make this banana character, but none as much as the Hefeweizen yeast. And by the way, you've got to produce this type of beer in a certain type of fermenter. Otherwise, you don't get so much of the desired banana-like character. Of course, the beer contains substantial amounts of yeast. It's very turbid. And that yeast, through natural conditioning, is going to produce very high levels of carbon dioxide. These are the most intensely carbonated beers that you're likely to find on the planet. And the other thing I will point out when you pour this beer out is never have a slice of lemon on top of the glass. That is a foreign body that should not be present when you're dispensing this particular type of beer. Also, from the wheat beer stable, we have a product known as Gosa. And this particular version of that from Sierra Nevada is Otra Vez, which contains significant levels of salt. Gosa is another German beer style that is deliberately quite salty. Now, all beers contain salt. It's just that for most of them, you wouldn't notice it particularly. You would actually notice it if it wasn't there, and it's due to sodium and potassium. So this is the saltiest beer you're going to find. And it's not going to be intensely salty. It's not like drinking brine, but there's a pronounced, significant, detectable level of salt. And the other thing that's in this particular beer is lime and blue agave. So this is a very refreshing beer, which is from the Gosa style. Finally, let's talk about another type of wheat beer, Weissbier. Not Weizenbier, but Weissbier, white beer. And that is a beer style that comes from the north of Germany. And Napoleon actually called it the champagne of the north. It's much weaker than the Hefeweizen types of product, particularly low in terms of maybe 2.8% alcohol by volume. And there's wheat malt in the grist, but as well as yeast, they use lactic acid bacteria. And these bacteria produce acid, which makes for sourness. So these have got a fairly strong sour character. And not everybody wants a beer that is too sour. So the traditional way of drinking this style of beer in Germany is to mix it with raspberry or perhaps Waldmeister, which means woodruff, sweet woodruff. And that makes the beer a pleasant green color. So it's not only St. Patrick's Day in Chicago where you can get a green beer. So there we have it, a wide range of ales. In the next lecture, we'll turn to bottom fermented beers, often referred to as lagers.